Uh-oh. Your boy is back. So get your pen and notebook ready, because this is Paleocrat Diaries. All right, you crazy maniacs, buckle in. It's another amazing episode of Paleocrat Diaries. I'm your host, the one and only Jeremiah Bannister, the original Paleocrat, the OG. We're broadcasting right here out of Team Tiny Dancer headquarters in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and it's great to have you along for the ride. Look, I gotta admit something. All right, total confession. From the heart, folks, it's been too long. It has. It's been way too long, and I'm just so bummed out about this. I keep saying, I'm going to do a whole bunch of episodes, and then life just comes crashing down like a ton of bricks. Okay, we've been working out in the yard, doing all of this work, and in fact, I got to give credit real quickly to a friend of mine. It's actually my daughter, the one who passed away, Samantha. She had these three friends, right? Kind of her Peter, James, and John. And of those three friends, you had Gladys, and you had Emily, and you had Clara. Well, Clara's dad, this guy's like a wonder worker. I mean, the guy knows how to do all sorts of stuff. He's got all sorts of tools, just an amazing handyman. And he offered to come over to the house and to help us to fix up certain things. A lot of stuff was just falling apart. We bought this house a number of years ago, and the weather in Michigan doesn't help. So we had cracks in the concrete everywhere. The stairs were kind of starting to fall apart. And he said, look, I'll come over and I'll help. And he did it, in fact, for a very, very good price. I won't say it because I don't want anybody else taking advantage of that. He did it out of the goodness of his heart. But the thing is, extremely generous man and very, very talented, and kind of a Hercules, actually. I mean, I'm a pretty strong guy myself. I mean, I can lift some decent weight. But this guy is another level. He's kind of like the strong man, like those strongman competitions where dudes pick up rocks and carry them 100 yards, where they're pulling semi-trucks behind them. He's kind of on that level of things, a really strong guy. But at the end of the month and a half, we came out way on top. I mean, we made this amazing brick sidewalk. It's beautifully designed in the front yard. We have new wooden steps. We repaired the chimney. We fixed the base of the porch. Built this beautiful retaining wall. In fact, it's made out of pine, and it still needs to be stained, but I don't want to lose kind of the colors that are there. There's this nice kind of creamish white and orange and yellows, and there's even a purplish red. So, I mean, it's beautiful, and I don't want to lose that when we stain it. But even down to like flower gardening and planting sod, just so many things that we did and accomplished in that period of time. And he did this, look, he did it after getting hurt, and that was scary. Because he was on my roof when it happened. I'm not going to lie. He was on my roof fixing that chimney, and he tore his calf muscle. We're grateful that it was just a tear, and that it took 2 weeks. And after that 2 weeks, he's just a trooper. Just hardcore, and he's right back at it. And we got it done, almost all of it. We still have a couple things we want to do in the backyard and different things like that. But for the season, it's way more than I could have ever hoped for. And I'm just eternally grateful, so I had to say that. But it wasn't just that. Okay, I was busy with other things. I did a watch party with Timothy Flanders of meaningofcatholic.com, and not sure how often we're going to do these videos. I'm hoping we're going to do them pretty regularly or more often, more frequently, but we've had a really good time. I did, of course, the interview with him where I talked about kind of my testimony and where I've come from and the crazy journey that I've been on in my life and where I'm at now. But the last one was about Christ the King, and we talked about Catholic social teaching and how it applies to the fullness of our lives. We're really excited that so many of you joined us there. We had a great time in the comments section. You can find it on Facebook. Of course, I would encourage you also to go support him by visiting that video at his YouTube channel, and you can find that by going to youtube.com/Paleocrat, and that's my channel. And if you go down into the Paleocrat Diaries playlist, you're going to see anytime I'm on another show, any interviews I do, anything like that, I always end up including that in the playlist, so you can just go ahead and put that in your favorites and you'll never miss out on anything. So I was a busy man, and it was very, very time consuming, and it made it difficult. I was exhausted by nighttime, and that's when I record these. I make sure the kids are in bed, their homework is done, we've eaten some food together, we do all of our routine as a family, and then when everything's done, I go ahead and I come in here and I start to record. But there was one more thing that I did during that time off here, and that other thing's really important. I don't want to spend too long on this, but I definitely want to just throw this out there because it was really a special time for me. And what it was is I went to the ballet. I love that sort of thing. I love ballet. I love the opera. I love theater in general. I like going to plays and things like that. But I don't get to go to ballet very often, and so I really enjoy it when I'm able to go. And so I was so excited when my sister gave me a call and asked if I would be willing to go along with her to go see the performance by the Grand Rapids Ballet of Firebird. It was gorgeous. It was absolutely stunning. There were 4 works, in fact, and all of them were exceptionally good. The first one was Mozart's Symphony, okay, and that was by James Safranco. He's the choreographer for that. You had Again, and the choreographer for that was Penny Saunders, and it's one of those where you got to really pay attention and try to understand what's being expressed by it. It wasn't as easy to understand as maybe Mozart's Symphony, which is more classical. You had Cold Virtues, which was my favorite of the night, even more than Firebird. Okay, I loved Cold Virtues. I thought that the way that it talked about society and the elites and love, even betrayal, I thought it was just powerful the way that they performed it. And all of the dancers were so amazing. It was the kind of performance where you can only imagine that there had to be a mistake at some point. But honestly, they were probably the only people who knew whether or not they made a mistake. And look, if they did make a mistake, then they're totally pros at this because it could have fooled everybody, right? Everything just looked as if it was part of the program, part of the routine. They even had pyrotechnics in this one scene where a dancer breaks this egg open and just fire comes bursting out. It was totally awesome, took everybody by surprise. And the costumes were perfect. They completely matched kind of the theme and tone of each one of these performances. And my favorite, though, by far, I mean, without a doubt, was Firebird. And I'm so glad to have gotten a program. I've got the program with the woman who played the part of Firebird, and she's striking this amazing pose. I could never do that myself. It's one of these leaps, and her arms are in the air. It's so iconic for the entire thing. And costume designer Sandra Woodall deserves an immense amount of praise for this, because that costume was totally mesmerizing. The colors, this bright, fiery orange, and the reflective pieces all along her arms and chest, as well as the long, flowing, bright orange hair and the feathers, everything. It was completely perfect. And I gotta say this, they were all very fit, okay? They're extremely athletic. I mean, these people are dancing for a long time, and by the end of each routine, they're just glistening with sweat. And the guys, right? Look, these dudes were totally ripped. Greek god type stuff. Like Michelangelo came back and chiseled them out of a big block of marble. I don't know what kind of diet and exercise their trainer has them doing, but honestly, these guys should consider putting it on DVD because, I'm serious, they'd make a fortune. It was a perfect evening. I mean, it just was. Well, actually, no, let me take it back. There was one thing that I wish that I would have done differently, and that is I wish I would have taken the opportunity to say hi to James Safranco. He's in his second year right now as the artistic director of the Grand Rapids Ballet. But prior to this, he spent 18 years as a soloist with the San Francisco Ballet. So there's a very good possibility that he danced many performances with my cousin, Julia Rowe. She's currently a soloist at the San Francisco Ballet, and it's really interesting. You can go online, you can read all about her. She's got really great profiles on her and everything, and she's traveled all over the place and been in remarkable locations all around the world. And I got to admit, it's kind of a bummer. It breaks my heart, in fact, because I love ballet, and she's an awesome cousin, and yet I've never seen her perform. And it's one of those things. It's on my bucket list, okay? And I'm kind of running out of time. I mean, yeah, she's younger than me. I'm 40. She's much younger. But at the same time, I don't know how long she'll be dancing. And so I really hope that I'll be able one day to see her perform in person. And so that's kind of one of those things that I really look forward to. But the reason I bring that up isn't just because I love ballet, right? It's really because I love my sister. And my sister's going through a lot. And I've said this on other shows, and I'm going to say it as often as I bring her up. But I strongly encourage everybody to please pray for her. She was diagnosed a couple years ago with an extremely aggressive kind of breast cancer. She was pregnant when it started. They thought it was a milk duct. It was not. And by the time she got in, the main lymph node that had been affected by this, the main tumor, was the size of an avocado. So it was massive. And it had spread to numerous parts of her body. And it was a while where it went away. But following Lent of this past year, she went back in, and she was afraid. She was feeling pain in her back, in different parts of her neck and stuff like that, and it has since spread to many different places. It was very painful for her, and the families had to have very serious conversations, and so it was really special to be able to spend time with her. She means a lot to my heart, and she means a lot to my family. And honestly, this is, I think, the first time, I think we both agreed on this, that it's the first time that either of us have ever spent time just together without anybody else, that it was just kind of a date night with my sister, to spend time just with her. And it was a powerful night, and just to be there right next to her the entire time and spend time with her, it's something that I'll cherish for the rest of my life. And so I'm very, very grateful for that. But that's why, right? I was involved in all of these things. But I'm back, okay? I'm back. And we've got this cool topic because I didn't have as much of a question. Last time I was unsure what I wanted to talk about. And this time I've known what I've wanted to talk about now for about a week, actually. It was a comment in response to the last video that I made. And if you haven't checked that out, please do. You can find it at youtube.com/Paleocrat. It's about the rise and triumph of Trump's deplorables. It talks about the history of the group called Middle American Radicals, the AKA deplorables, okay? But in the comments section, I had some good comments, of course. I always do. We have a great audience here at Paleocrat Diaries. But I had one that really stood out. It was from a friend of mine named Dilyn. And I've known Dilyn now since, I think, 2011. He was an early listener to Paleo Radio when it was on WPRR. And we had a listener that was a good friend. He was actually a guy in high school. He lived not far from my house. And we began talking. He eventually went to college, Michigan State. He went for philosophy, studied mathematics, things like that. So we've always had great conversations, and it's been a real delight, even a pleasure and an honor, to witness his development over the years and to watch as he's been transformed into the man that he is now. But he was curious about something, and he posted this comment, and I'm just going to quote it because it hits directly on something that I've actually wanted to talk about for a very long time. He asked this, quote, "What is the catalyst for going from being strictly opposed to revealing your political voting behaviors to broadly and widely broadcasting your political proclivities?" And he has a little thinking emoji, right? And it's a valid question because many of you may not know this, but when I was on radio, beginning around the time of 2012, I adopted a policy of no longer publicly endorsing a candidate. And I actually went further than this. I also did not really like talking about who I voted for even after the fact. Now, in 2012, I did. And in 2016, though, I didn't do this, okay? And part of the reason why was pretty simple. I knew that with the ownership of WPRR being in the hands of this foaming-at-the-mouth progressive guy, that if he ever learned that I voted for Donald Trump, that, yeah, my butt would be totally kicked to the curb. And wow, lo and behold, look at that. It's exactly what happened. But that wasn't my only reason for maintaining that position. I wasn't just looking out for my work. I was also of the persuasion, right? I had embraced the idea that I'd learned in college regarding neutrality and journalistic ethics. And so I actively and positively made the case that people who did the work of talk radio and people who were trying to be journalistic and trying not to simply be mouthpieces of propaganda, but instead fountainheads of information, that they should strive to kind of keep a distance, maybe even an antagonistic relationship with the party system. And I also made the case for kind of an open party structure where you would incorporate a more democratic sampling. You'd have a greater inclusion of libertarians and Constitution Party candidates and Green Party candidates and Reform Party candidates, because I believe that this would better represent the people, especially since we've gotten to a place, and we'll talk about this as this episode goes on, but we've gotten to a place where there are huge swaths of this country that feel underrepresented or just straight up misrepresented, or even worse, flat out maligned by the people, not only within the media, but also in the party system itself. So he's right. Something, in fact, did change. But the question is why? What was it? Why did I change? So we're going to have to hop in the old DeLorean here. We're going to have to travel back in time to May 28th, 2010. Because on May 28th, 2010, I posted a blog. In fact, if I remember right, I posted it to my old blog site, right? My old Blogger account. This is one of my first blogs I owned and operated right alongside Xanga. Okay, I had a Xanga website called Paleocrat, etc. Later on, I made one called Paleocrat Tribune, but this predates that. So this is old school, right? And it kind of gives an idea for where I was at the time, how I changed later, and why I believe as I do now. And look, I'm kind of breaking a little bit of protocol here. I ordinarily will take a book or a chapter of a book and use that in order to discuss a specific topic, and I do a lot of quotations from those books. But with this particular blog, I'd rather just provide the link in the comment section below. I encourage you to check it out on your own time to see how it's reflected in what I say here. But I want to be able to just use the themes, some of the ideas, the statistics, even a few of the names and events that took place in that year that led to my believing as I did at that time, to help inform as to why I understand, believe, and practice as I do right now. I begin by talking about how neutrality is obsolete, if in fact it ever existed at all. But this shouldn't be very surprising. Neutrality is a difficult thing to understand, if for no other reason than the fact that neutrality is so foreign. And that's how I described it in the post, is that it was foreign. And I may have done better, if I was being maybe even more forthright about it, to say that it's a phantasm. It's this kind of self-affirming and self-deluding opiate for well-wishers and daydream believers and out-and-out propagandists. And while that last sentence may have come off a little bit cynical, the real reason for this has to do with the mere fact, right, this unavoidable consequence of existence, that bias is part of human life. It's a subtle thing. Maybe because it's always there, quietly underlying everything we think and say and do. And while most people are reluctant to admit or even recognize the role that these biases play in their thoughts and lives, this hesitancy holds particularly true for anyone who's involved in professions of representation. These individuals believing themselves to serve as a kind of spokesperson for the masses of mankind. Consider the journalist. Journalists convince themselves all the time that what they're doing is a kind of science. It's why we see such a heavy reliance on stats and citations, on charts and graphs. And it's why we're repeatedly assured that the journalist's job is just to state the facts, to tell the story and let it lead wherever it may. And look, there may be some truth to that, but it would be in the most abstract and useless sense, for the entire game changes the very moment that someone puts their thoughts to the case, the very moment that they put their pen to the paper. For at that point, neutrality really is fair game as a fair claim. You can actually question whether or not the person writing is able to suspend their bias, that safeguards are in place to make sure that bias isn't coming through. Consider my experience at Olivet College, okay? I was one of the only openly conservative students in the school, and I was the only one on radio. In fact, maybe one of the only people to openly speak up about this during class. And it wasn't surprising. I was forbidden, in fact, from receiving the school's top honor in political science. And that happened for 3 years because of the dictates of the former president. This is a liberal institution. What would that signal to their donors? The greatest political mind in the student body was a Roman Catholic theocrat. So there was a chilling effect with this. And the journalism professors, they recognize this. This kind of conversation came up in class. But the thing is that they minimize the impact. And I see this all the time. Whenever journalists are asked this question about bias, it's always minimized. They will often say, well, the kind of people that are attracted to journalism in general are people who are more liberally minded students, and they would be interested in getting involved in controversial issues and free speech and things like that. I mean, that's kind of true. There's some truth to this, but that's all the more reason, I think, to be attentive to the bubble that you find yourself in a journalism department. This kind of self-confirming thing, right? That's around you, these information silos where you're just getting your information about the world from the same sources because you have the same worldviews. And there's a chilling effect to all of this. How does it affect story selection? How does it affect editorial positions? How does it affect the selection of letters to the editor that people are going to publish? Maybe most importantly, at least for students going into journalism, how does it affect getting into a mainstream journalistic institution? And that's where the rubber really hits the road. Not only with talented conservative journalists, but also with the reader. And think about this. Journalists for a long time, they've been loath to admit that their network of beliefs and values, right, their worldview, that it has any impact whatsoever on their work. You see this play itself out in debates over bias that bleed onto the network at times, especially when you have debates between Republicans and Democrats where Republicans bring this up. But they have legs to stand on, and in fact, they can rely on scientific methodology in order to demonstrate this. And it's a weird suspension of scientific belief for the liberal group to go, well, this is a conspiracy theory. But look at the studies that were done. I mentioned one in my last episode talking about the study that was done on mainstream media sources like CNN, MSNBC, NBC, ABC, New York Times, Washington Post, and others, that there's this negative coverage ratio of about 90 to 10% against President Trump. That's 90% negative. So no one was surprised, especially not conservatives, when an undercover video was released, when Project Veritas released an undercover expose of CNN that talked about their bias. Their own staff admitted to it. In fact, and I got to give them props for this, it was actually kind of a relief to hear some of their own staff complain about this and call it a problem, admitting that the pundits there play patty cake with Democrats, all the while going balls to the wall against any Republican that comes on their channel. One of them said, and it's not an exact quote, but it sums it up pretty good. He said, people know where Hannity and Tucker are coming from. Why can't CNN just be honest about where they're coming from? You got people like Don Lemon, Chris Guido Cuomo, Anderson Cooper. We already know where they stand. It's obvious. It's obvious in the way that they frame their questions. They wear their bias on their sleeve. All the while, they ridicule critics. They malign them as conspiracy theorists who dare to question their journalistic integrity. It's a joke. The same kind of goes for Fox News. They pitch this idea that they're fair and balanced. And it's true to some degree. I mean, look, you've got this bias toward the right, which is quite obvious. You can see it by who they bring on, what they emphasize, the stories they cover. You can see it. But at the same time, the same scientific studies that talk about the positive to negative ratio of coverage, they're far more balanced than the other networks and news channels. There's still a bias. You can see it. You can say, well, look, it says 70 to 30%. Yes, that's better than 90 to 10. And look at how stuff plays out. You've got serious debates, even stuff on air. Just this week you had it. And these arguments, these are in-house, right? They divide Trump's populist right from the establishment never Trump George W. Bush faction. And strangely enough, that's actually more that you can say regarding the general state of journalism. Unsurprisingly, readers and viewers often charge the mainstream media of being biased. And look, if we're being honest with ourselves, truth is, anyone with a brain, right, or a fully functioning pair of eyeballs, everyone knows it. It's palpable. You can cut it with a butter knife. Worse yet, it's totally predictable. And before moving on, let me say one more thing real quick about Fox News, even about conservative talk radio. People will often charge Fox with being born out of this desire to make money on the backs of dumb people. But this charge reveals two things. First, while it's true that Fox banked on the idea that it would make tons of loot, it only knew that it would make that much money because of market forces, more specifically of supply and demand in the market, and that this demand was created by a vacuum. It was a lack of representation resulting from bias. And they knew that those people were out there. They knew because they heard people, they read studies, they looked at polls that talked about individuals who were complaining about bias and were completely brushed off. And secondly, these dummies are dummies in the eyes of whom? They're dummies in the eyes of the very institutions wherein they lack representation. They're dummies in the eyes of the very institutions maligning them and their interests as dumb. In the end, The same liberal albatross that was dangling around the necks of teachers and students in journalism school, it stuck around. Imagine that. It didn't fly away after graduation. Only now, it's a lot heavier, bearing the weight of time and of institutional bias and groupthink. Consider an old example, right? One taken from my blog, okay? There's this guy named Justin Hinkley. Justin Hinkley, currently, he's the editor over at Alpena News, and he used to work for the Lansing State Journal, but he got his start at the Battle Creek Enquirer, okay? That was the rag that I was always kind of going against when I had the show Bannister and Sotheby. But he wrote this half-hearted hit piece about me during my time on TV, and if I remember correctly, he was behind some of the more undesirable tensions that I experienced throughout a collegiate spat that I had with this Marxist Muslim professor at the college. But honestly, I always still liked Justin Hinkley. There was something about him. Honestly, he seemed like a decent guy. And sure, he was a rookie, but it had to be kind of hard to report on somebody like me. I'm not going to lie, it's got to be a difficult task. I'm pretty tenacious, and I might even be a little bit controversial, so I had to give the guy props. And I've been in plenty of conversations, if you want to call them that, they're really shouting matches, with people far his superior, okay? I've been on the line with a lot of editors and yelling matches. And I don't normally lose those. In fact, I can't recall one time where I actually did. But the thing is, he had to be a pretty brave guy to deal with me. It's like one of those situations where you really admire the bear or the lion at the zoo, but those are in cages, and it's a whole different ballgame when you invite them into your home. And I can only imagine that it felt a little bit like that back then when he was interviewing me. He wrote this blog, though, and it was about neutrality. It was published in the heyday of anti-war protests and the Tea Party. And he said this, and this is it's so telling, and it just plays into exactly what I'm saying. He says, I and several of my colleagues have had a number of conversations about what might have caused this distrust in the media, this anger and perceived bias, and we haven't been able to lay a finger on it. End quote. That's remarkable. I mean, just think about this. Here he is, neck deep in the biz, right? Yet he's at a total loss as to why readers have a general distrust of news reporting, that they perceive bias. He's not even willing to admit that bias is there. That's the problem. They're not able to put their finger on it. I don't know if he went to journalism school. At least they were willing to admit it. But these writers, these journalists, maybe even editors at the Battle Creek Enquirer, just simply could not understand the reasons people have, the reasons their own readers have for accusing the paper of bias. I have to wonder. Were they really unaware of the fact that storytelling requires the writer to pick and choose? Think about that for a second. Were they really oblivious to the harsh reality of emphasis and tone? Has the entire gatekeeper concept eluded these people? If so, we have a lot more to worry about than perceived bias. They'd be blissfully oblivious. Any given paper can report on a whole bunch of different things, and all from this wide variety of angles. Consider for a moment the role of the gatekeeper. Any given paper, just pick any, wherever you live, whatever the paper is in your area. Think about how many different topics they could report on. I mean, how often do people read the paper and go, man, I wish this was in the paper. Why aren't they covering this? Or why aren't they covering that? Why are they focusing on this dumb story? And they can report on it from a wide variety of different angles. And that often upsets people too, as they feel that the emphasis was on the wrong thing. It wouldn't have been what they would have emphasized. And in fairness, we got to admit, choosing which stories to cover, that can actually be difficult, right? And deciding from which angles to cover the stories, that doesn't make it any easier. But the truth is, it has to be done. A paper only has so many pages, especially when you're packing them with these oversized photos. And the same goes for TV and radio. I mean, both TV and radio, both of them are following a strict schedule. Both of them are beholden to the intrusion of commercial advertisements. And let me say this as a kind of side note. Commercial advertisements aren't really much of an intrusion. They are to you, but it's really the other way around, okay? That news is the intrusion in commercial programming. It's what connects them together. TV news, radio, doesn't matter. It's there to sell soap. It's there to sell you some Viagra. That's what it is. And TV has preferences, especially TV. It has to be sensational, has to be outrageous, enraging, worrying, funny. And most importantly, it has to be captivating. It has to be entertaining, amusing. And because it's a visual medium, it relies heavily on moving images. All of them visual. Even when it's an audio, you'll always see it's not just a black screen with words. They normally put a person's face with it. They normally have words on the screen at the bottom that are moving, right? A little ticker at the bottom that's moving and telling you things. And nowadays it's cluttered. If you look at the old newscasts and you look at the ones now, the ones now have numbers all over the place. At the top and the bottom, it's got a picture in the corner. It's got the logo at the bottom right. It's just all over the place. You know, in the past, it was a guy just kind of staring at a screen. But they figured out that to have moving images are important. And this, I learned this actually not just in school, but I learned it just kind of in everyday life when we had a fire. There was a house up the road from our home here, and it just completely devoured. I mean, the whole thing went up, just totally done. They've replaced it with a beautiful home, fixed it up. But the thing is, I was there when it happened that night. And I'm seeing all these fire trucks come in, and I run out, and I've got my camera, and I took some great pictures and everything. And I wasn't thinking. Part of me, in the back of my mind, I was reserving the possibility. I was kind of pondering whether or not I should actually send these to the news because this was a big deal. But I wasn't really thinking of the fact that I would be reaching out to TV news. And I'm taking pictures. So when the TV news shows up, and it didn't take long for them to show up, that when they showed up, I said, yeah, I've got these images here. They weren't interested. Why would you be interested with a fire that's not moving if there's anyone else in the crowd that has a video of it? So you're actually seeing the flames bursting out of the house. So they're relying on these kind of images. So you have gatekeepers. Because of all of these things, you have these individuals that have to make decisions regarding what's in and what's out. Some stories are given prominence. Others are excluded altogether. And look, page placement is a huge deal. Trust me, I've seen the difference between being tucked away at the bottom of the back page versus being paraded on page 1A. I've had that happen with stories specifically focused on me. And trust me, it's not always fun. And so I've seen the difference, though, on the way that plays. And writers, it's not just the gatekeepers at the top. I don't want to just lay the blame there. It's something that affects writers as well. You know, they choose from which facts to reference. They choose which statistics to emphasize, which people to quote. But you're kind of spinning this web. You're putting together selected facts. You're putting together selected statistics and saying that these coupled together are telling the story in the way that I want the story to be told. But that creates a whole number of different statistics that are left off to the side, that are no less true. They're no less factual, but they're alternative. Though that's what Kellyanne Conway, by the way, for all the flack Kellyanne Conway got when talking about alternative facts, that's what she's talking about. She knew what she was talking about. And any fair-minded journalist, any journalist who got on TV, and most of the people on these TV shows, a lot of these people, they're not even journalists, they're reporters. They know how to read from a script. A lot of them, in fact, are actors. And they know how to pontificate. They know how to put on a show. And they just ran hog wild with alternative facts. All it simply means are those are the facts that you did not include in the web that you were spinning to tell the story that you, as a gatekeeper, that you chose and selected for the story you're trying to tell. And every single one of these things are necessary. I mean, media wouldn't be able to survive without it. But each and every one of these decisions, they lend credibility to complaints about bias. And deep down, in their heart of hearts, owners, editors, journalists, and reporters, they all know this. Every single one of them. After all, it's for these very reasons that the media used to have a strict code of checks and balances. And they still do. I mean, there's some, even in-house, right? They have these uniform systems of style and usage. This has a standardizing effect, right? They have certain words that you've seen maybe the way that it plays out. Every once in a while, you'll see public debates about style and usage. I know it's kind of a weird thing to say, but we all know about it from the debates that took place over media institutions deciding to no longer use the phrase illegal immigrant, but instead to say undocumented migrant or undocumented workers. Another example would be found in their use of phrases like anti-abortion and pro-choice. But these also have framing effects, okay? If you call somebody pro, that's a positive prime on somebody. You're priming somebody with this positive idea that they are for something. And if you're against something, then that's a negative frame, just right out of the gate. It's a negative frame. But these debates happen, okay? So they have this standardizing effect. It does make it easy. In fact, it makes it predictable for readers to understand how a specific word is being used. So you're not going to have a bunch of different terms used for the same group of people, or even the same kind of titles and offices. Even uniform uses of time zone designations, like is it Eastern Standard Time, EST, or is it simply Eastern Time? It can be confusing, and so to have it uniform makes it a lot easier. There's no industry-wide style and usage manual. You still have differences amongst different institutions. For example, we see this play itself out in the way the New York Times uses the phrase Mr. Trump in every instance referring to him after the very first instance, which would normally be President Donald Trump. And while some instances of style and usage may not play themselves out with a lot of bias, I mean, what would it really matter if it's ET or EST other than the confusion of is it estimated or establishment? Is it some kind of an abbreviation? But there are other mechanisms within style and usage that really are loaded with immense amounts of bias. And some of them, in fact, one of them in particular, is extremely deceptive, even self-deceptive, in glossing over the presence and the role of bias in reporting. And it's something we've heard a million times over, maybe a billion times, maybe a trillion. We've heard it a lot. And it's this: we report both sides of the story. But is this satisfactory? Of course not. Okay, that's why you actually would have to go to multiple channels in order to try to get both sides of a story. But the problem really goes much deeper than this. Because if you try to do this whole both sides of the story thing, you oversimplify. The truth is, it doesn't just always boil down to Republican versus Democrat, or conservative versus liberal, traditional versus progressive, or black versus white, or even men versus women. That's just radically unrealistic. But realism isn't the reason for this mechanism. The reason for this mechanism is one of just pure utility. It makes it easy, especially when you have so many limitations like time and space and angle and quotation. And just imagine the difficulties that you would incur when trying to represent every single position out there. It would be complete insanity. I mean, it would just be total chaos. You'd basically stop writing articles and have to resort to writing books. And not just books, but encyclopedias. Or if we didn't want to go full blown, okay, and we didn't want to say, well, you got to include every single topic, how would we somehow boil this down and yet at the same time not oversimplify it? And I think maybe it would look less like the modern article and more like those books that come out, you see them in Christian bookstores, that talk about 4 different views regarding the doctrine of hell, or 4 different views on the book of Revelation. Sure, the vast majority of Christians believe in 1 or 2 of the takes in any of these given topics, but these multi-view models are not overextending themselves. They still limit their time and space to views bearing some kind of historical or contemporary relevance. And yet their boundaries are broadened beyond the limits of the dominant schools of theological thought. Admittedly, this format would be better made for books and not for newspapers, but I think it might hold a key into the formation of a better journalistic method, even for television. Television news is notorious for featuring these all-star panels, but most of these are made of contributors working for these institutions, sharing the same beliefs and biases, and this results in a kind of echo chamber, not only in-house, but industry-wide. And something along these lines may not only benefit media, but also benefit our constitutional republic, the entire nation, our political culture, the way that we converse with one another on these matters. Because whether the media likes it or not, The fact is that Americans, while they may not be willing to so-called, quote-unquote, waste their vote, we've heard that a million times regarding third parties, they share values and beliefs on a whole host of issues that are more aligned with those parties than with the major parties, making the reasons why they don't support the third parties more to do with utility, right? More to do with the fact that they would feel as though they're wasting their vote, that it's disconnected from a structure and a system that has power, than it does with whether or not they actually disagree with the policy positions of minor parties. We see that with the rise of Donald Trump on the right, and we see that with the rise of AOC and Bernie Sanders on the left. And those are just political parties. We aren't even talking about groups or institutions, religions, worldviews that are outside of the party system. So the truth of the matter is that all of these things are far more complex than what we make them out to be. And the reason is simple. It's because people and issues are complex. And while the dialectic of journalistic dualism might keep it simple, stupid, disagreements are hardly simple. And the people involved in the disagreement are rarely ever that stupid. I don't want to place all the blame on the media, and I don't want to act like I'm immune from these charges, because I'm not. So I need to say, look, readers and journalists have more in common than may often be admitted, especially when it comes to bias, okay? Complaints about bias in others, it typically flows from the same font, and that is one's own personal bias. And unless other people are interested in publishing podcasts or zines or newsletters or blogs or even in attending journalism school, okay, to start something like Breitbart or the Daily Caller or Paleocrat Diaries, whatever you're going to do, then it's not entirely fair to bash journalists for things that are inherent to their enterprise. Okay, maybe they could do better about relying on the inverted pyramid, where you place the really important stuff at the top instead of the bottom, which has basically been, we're living in the day and age of kind of an inverted pyramid. We're back to a pyramid structure where the really important stuff is at the bottom. So if you really want to know what the caveats are in any article or what the really, really important stuff is, the stuff's the game changer, right? They're playing like an M. Night Shyamalan thing where at the end of the story, they're like, and all of a sudden now a twist, and it completely reverses everything. The problem is most people don't read that far. And this is journalism 101 type stuff. In fairness, though, it's kind of a lose-lose situation. First of all, it's a radically unrealistic expectation to demand that someone involved in media is neutral or that they don't have any bias in their reporting. And I know this firsthand because, as I said earlier, I maintained the prevailing industry view of journalistic neutrality, the kind that I was taught in journalism school that I eventually bought into. And the truth is, I tried really hard to do it, or at least I convinced myself that I was trying. I made clever arguments, even fanciful, to defend my idea of neutrality, my idea that what I was doing was without bias. But it wasn't true. Look, it affected me in ways where I eventually consigned myself to playing the part of a devil's advocate, even when I was talking about issues that I actually believed in. Think about that. And it was based on a motto. My motto was simple, and in fact, I think it's a good one. It's not unique to me at all. It's been said a bazillion times by a bazillion people. But praise where praise is due, criticism where criticism is due. And this is true regardless of political party or religious affiliation. It's admirable. Especially from someone like me, right, who believes pundits and even people in general should keep partisanship on a tight leash, even at the cost, and I'm serious about this, even at the cost of losing access or standing under a cloud of suspicion from power players in the party system. But see, here's the thing. I had my own biases, and I still do. It could be seen in the stories that I covered. It could be seen in the stories that I tossed to the cutting room floor. It could be seen in how I choose to cover those stories, where they headlined, How did I frame the headline? Were they part of a monologue? Or did I just simply fold them into this flyby segment or soundbite just before going to break? I even selected music that was intended to prime the listener. You know, if you have a fun segment coming up and you're going to talk about something hilarious, you normally have fun music. If it's something that's more serious or even a little bit sad, you play music that's a little more serious. And whenever it was time to throw down, I'd bump some Jay-Z, baby. I would. I'd break out the old flutes. And that's what I did. I mean, because it primed not only me, but also the listener to anticipate, to be prepared for what was about to happen, to be in the mood or in the zone. And I had preferred candidates, too. You know, I stopped publishing my voter's guide. I used to have a voter's guide where I would list my endorsements. I think it was called the I'm a Smarter Voter Than You voter's guide, I think. And a lot of people used it. I would print out these voter guides, and they would bring them to the booth with them, and that's how they would vote. But the truth is, it didn't take a profit with these like magical eyeballs to see that I didn't plan to vote for Mitt Romney in 2012. And there were a lot of people who knew, or at least worried, that I voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And there's the catalyst. Election 2016. I tried with all of my might. You don't even know. I tried with everything I had to play the role of a neutral commentator. But there I was, talking about Hillary's health, the negative consequences of free trade and illegal immigration, fake news, malicious bird doggers, the dangers of a globalist New World Order, the resurgence of these foaming at the mouth Russophobes, the balkanization of identitarian politics, the authoritarian impulses of political correctness, and of course the degeneracy that I believe to be on full display during the Women's March in Washington, D.C. I wasn't parroting DNC talking points. I wasn't doing that. You know, so my being a Trump supporter, it was kind of an open secret. And yet there I was. I was playing that game. That pretentiously pious journalistic game of pretended neutrality. I started asking myself, how was I any better than Chris Cuomo? How was I not playing the same activist game as Jorge Ramos? How was I any different than Brian Stelter, you know, from CNN's Unreliable Sources show? And why did I feel that even partisans like Rachel Maddow and Rush Limbaugh were being more forthright with their audience than I was being with mine? They weren't pretending. Their audience never wondered where they were coming from. I mean, okay, there's a cost to that. You know, there's a lot of ditto heads and mockingbirds out there. But at least they're being honest. At least you know who they are and what they stand for. And you can take it or leave it. And in a weird way, that kind of honesty, you know, even from brazen partisans, it enables and it empowers the consumer to make a more fully informed decision regarding whether or not they agree with any given position that they advance. Or maybe, more importantly, the consumer can more accurately know and determine when and to what extent they might be getting fed a bunch of spin. But at least you know it. You know, these are things that I've thought about for a few years. I would say even before Donald Trump came down the escalator, but that would be a good proximate starting point, right? Because I can't pinpoint the ultimate starting point, so let's just run with that. Say, when he came down that escalator, right, and the events that transpired following that event, I began really considering and reconsidering my position on neutrality and how it affected me as a personality on the air talking about really important issues. I was telling somebody actually tonight, I was telling them, you know, I said I kept my mouth shut for a long time, and yet I watched as the controversy began to evolve, right? After Trump came down the escalator, the way that the entire reception from the public, how it evolved. At first you had people saying, well, this is just a joke. Trump's not really planning on running. This is maybe some kind of scheme. He's just trying to do it for his business. He doesn't really believe anything he says. And then it started to be, well, he would be a terrible president. You can't really believe him. And then it turned into, this guy's really, really wrong on a lot of stuff. And then it turned into, he might be Hitler, and we might be facing the Third Reich. And I watched as this happened. I saw as people went from, I disagree with this person, that's a stupid argument, to I disagree with this person, I think you're bad, to I disagree with this person, I want to punch him in the face. I saw people leave their friends and their family to completely disown them, disavow them. I was in rooms with people that were talking about violence being done against Trump people, against people wearing MAGA hats, and they would whisper and say things, that, well, I wouldn't have done that, but they kind of get what's coming to them. Maybe they should have thought about that before they put on that hat. And I'm in the room with them. It was a frightening thing to see, and I got worried. I remember I started talking. I talked to Joe Elder, my old co-host with this, my old partner at Paleo Radio. And we talked, and I said, look, man, this is the language of all of this is getting so hot. How do you turn it back? How do you turn back the idea that you've just literally called somebody a Nazi? How do people do that? What will it take? I started to become convinced that what it was going to take was people who are intelligent and well-read, who are able to communicate their reasons for supporting the president in a reasonable fashion. You can disagree, but it's at least reasonable. You can have a discussion back and forth. That it's going to take those individuals to begin standing up and saying something. And I didn't. I just watched as we devolved into this terrible, wicked place. And I finally had it. And it really came about, ultimately, after I returned to the Catholic Church. Because the Catholic Church, look, they're not, it's a very divided thing over Donald Trump. In America, there's a lot of Catholic Trump supporters. There's also a lot of Catholic people who absolutely can't stand him. And so it's not as if, well, you're in a religious body that's just totally beholden to the Trump thing. No, believe me on this. But the thing is, I got to a place where I was believing something, and I had to begin facing the fact that what I decided to do and how this was going to change my life, that it was eventually going to be public. I was a public person. I hosted a show. I'd done that my whole life. Eventually, I knew I was going to get back on that microphone. And so I knew that when that happened, that there was going to be a lot of explaining to do. And I kind of thought to myself and said, well, I'm going to have to explain that, so I may as well explain the other part too, right? It's just going to have to happen. And it forced me to say, if I don't do that as a Catholic, if I do not admit where I stand, if I don't admit what God had done to my heart, if I don't admit that I had gotten on my knees and confessed my sins and begged God to take me back, that I begged for forgiveness, if I didn't admit that, if I hid it under a bushel, that I was doing something not just unfortunate, but something sinful, in fact, hateful, that it would have been hateful to others, and that it would have been hateful to God, ungrateful and unthankful. And so I was in a real bind. I had to do it. I didn't want to be brash, but I needed to admit of my bias. I needed to admit that I had certain beliefs, and that those beliefs played a huge role. In fact, that dictated my thoughts and my behaviors. I couldn't be neutral. And the truth is, I experienced for a while when I wasn't, I was following the spiritual advisement of my confessor talking to me about, avoid radio. Don't do any radio shows, no podcasts, no blogs, no videos, no nothing, no anything, no interviews, no nothing for 12 months. Go to church, go to the sacraments, frequent confession, frequent communion, read your Bible, pray your brains out, and spend a lot of time with your family. And take walks in nature. Do that sort of stuff. Get involved in the church. Get involved in the local community. Do things in real life. Unplug. But I still had friends. And I had friends that were worried and wanted to know where I was in my life. I'd gone through all of this crazy stuff with Samantha, and they were along with me for the ride for that. They were there through thick and thin. So they wanted to know, how you doing? What are you up to? Some of them had a feeling that I was finding my way back to the church. I'd gone through a lot of things. Some of them were surprised. Some were let down. Some were very upset. Some of them unfriended me. In fact, I've kind of been draining the swamp, I guess, because all of a sudden there's a lot of people. I think I've lost in the last 2 weeks. I think I've lost maybe 20 or more followers on Facebook. It's okay. It's okay, because the truth is, they know where I'm coming from. They know where I stand. They know what they're dealing with. And they have a right to make their informed judgment about me. They can say, I don't really like him anymore. He's a real dirtbag. He's kind of like a theocrat now. And they can do that. But at least I'm not playing him. I'm not dragging him along, jerking him around, sitting there saying, look, this is who I really am. This is what I've really done. This is where I stand. I believe this. God changed my life. God forgave me. He transformed me. And I'm grateful for this. But now they know. And now they know I voted for Donald Trump. It's kind of a double doozy. But I was surprised about something. I was surprised to see that while the vast majority of my friends that I had acquired as an unbeliever, that while they disagreed with me, they've remained my friends. We don't talk as much, but when we do, it's cordial. In some cases, even more than cordial. I've had people reach out to me and thank me for talking about that. They said, look, I don't agree with your conclusions, but you know what? I'm starting to think that maybe that I have more in common and that I can relate more with people who voted for Donald Trump than I really thought before. It doesn't mean they like him. It doesn't mean they support him. Same thing with Jesus. Doesn't mean that they're going to all of a sudden just start going to Mass. But they know where I'm coming from. And they're listening. And they're communicating. And we're friends. I'm going to end telling you another story real quick about my mom. I have a profound love and respect for my mom. And in fact, I'll tell you this, you got to keep it on the down low, right? You can't tell any of your friends. I'll just deny that I ever said it. You can't go back and hear it on my podcast. But in private, when I speak to her, she's mommy. That's her name to me. It always has been and it always will. But when I became an unbeliever, my mom was really saddened by it. I mean, completely heartbroken. Her and my dad, they were really supportive of me, even back as far, they helped me in Bible college, very supportive of me through terrible things, and all the issues that I had growing up. And yet there she was, always by my side. So when I rejected God, my mom was especially devastated. And she didn't tell me. I knew she was, and she would occasionally, say, look, I don't like talking about that kind of thing. But she didn't go into a lot of depth about it. She kind of let me do my thing. And she just prayed for me. But she recently told me, we were on the phone, and she said, I have to confess something to you. And that's really rare, actually, that she's ever had to confess. I mean, she's an amazing woman, and I'm always on that end of the bargain there. I'm having to confess something to her. But she said she had to confess something to me, and what it was that there was a time when I was an unbeliever that she thought I was a lost cause and that I'd never come back, that I would just simply remain outside the church for the remainder of my life. And her husband, my stepdad, he's a really great guy. He said, look, you got to believe that God can work on him. And my mom just kind of said, look, you don't understand. This is bad, and it's been a long time. And if Jeremiah didn't come back when Sammy was going through what she was going through, then now that he's lost her, there's just no way. And he said, don't give up hope about that. Well, over time, took about 1.5 years after my daughter died, but things transpired. Ideas began to form, seeds began to get planted, and eventually I found myself at various crossroads, and God was really moving on my life. And I was nervous to talk to my mom about it, but I did talk to people like my sister. And my sister, she knew about it, in fact, for months before my mom was notified, and my sister's the one who told her. And my mom just flat out said, she said, I'll believe it when I see it. And she said, Jeremiah, I just didn't believe that. I'd heard all the things that you said. I read the post that you made. I had conversations with you. I knew where you stood, and I could not bring myself to believe it. Even when your sister said it, even when other people said it, I had to see it first. And she said she was sorry. So she was surprised when I told her that she shouldn't have been sorry about that. And in fact, I'm actually glad, because the truth is, most of my life has been based on words. Tons of talk and not enough action. And I understand why you would need to see this. That you would need to know it. That there would be nothing hidden. That I wouldn't hide it under a bushel and keep it all to myself. But you needed me to actually live it. And you wanted to see me live it. And the same thing applies with this. With journalism. With this show. I'm going to say a lot of words. I've said a lot of words already. I don't know what the word count would be right now. But I've said a lot. And there's a whole bunch left to come. I have huge plans for this show. But the truth is, I'm far more interested now. Whether it's politics, whether it's business, whether it's family, and most importantly with God, that it's not just about the words. It's about walking the talk. It's about actually living what I'm saying and being honest about it and open about it. Not just with myself, not just with God, but also with my friends and even with the people that would be my enemies. To say, this is who I am. This is what I believe. Love it or hate it. This is who I am. This is where I stand. Not in memoriam, but in defense. I believe what I believe. And like Rich Mullins said, it's what makes me what I am. So if you hear this, and you decide that you don't want to be friends anymore, or you no longer have an interest in listening to the program, then so be it. It's okay. If, on the other hand, you hear what you're hearing now and you say, you know what, I may disagree, but I want to remain your friend. I still want to listen to your show. Then I'm especially grateful. I don't want to lose you as a friend. I don't want to lose you as a listener. I care about you, and I care about you because of you, who you are. And I'm just thankful that you feel the same way about me. So back to my friend Dilyn, the one who posted the comment that inspired this episode. I don't know if you're entirely satisfied with this. You may have disagreements. But as someone who's known me for a long time, and for all the other people who've listened who've known me for a long time, and even for people who may be hearing me for the first time, my hope and my prayer is this, that you can hear in my voice that I'm laying myself open and bare. I'm not going to hide. I'm not going to hide under a bushel. I'm going to be me, biases and all, not just because I can't avoid it, not just because it's inevitable, not just because it's simply part of the nature of the program, but because I believe it's right, and that in fact it's been right all along. And that for all the supposed benefits of journalistic neutrality, that it's better for me, for you, for everyone, that we just lay ourselves bare, that we simply refuse to be anything other than that which we truly are. For it's in that way, and maybe even that way alone, that people may truly know me, that they may truly know you, and that from there, it's up to them and to God what to do. Love this video? What a coincidence! I do too! Now head on over to Paleocratdiaries.com for more videos, blogs, parodies, and reviews, even Team Tiny Dancer stuff. And don't forget to check out our new members and services pages. It's how I pay for my kids to attend Catholic school. Until next time, Memento Mori.